A black teen stood trembling in court, sure he'd be convicted. But when the judge saw his face, her hands started shaking and she immediately called a recess. The reason why left the entire courtroom in tears. Marcus Johnson's sneakers pounded against the sidewalk as he rushed through the quiet streets of Oakwood Heights. The setting sun cast long shadows between the mansion-sized houses, and his backpack, heavy with library books, thumped against his spine with each step. He needed to catch the last bus home. The sound of police sirens pierced the evening air. Marcus barely registered it at first, just another sound in the wealthy neighborhood where his mom cleaned houses. But the sirens grew louder. Closer. Stop right there. A voice boomed through a megaphone. Put your hands where we can see them. Marcus froze. His heart hammered in his chest as two police cruisers screeched to a halt beside him, lights flashing. 4 officers jumped out, weapons drawn. On the ground. Now! His mother's words from years ago echoed in his head. If the police ever stop you, do exactly what they say. Don't argue. Don't run. Just comply. Marcus slowly raised his hands, his fingers trembling. I didn't do anything. I sat on the ground. He dropped to his knees, then lay face down on the cold concrete. His library books spilled from his unzipped backpack. Rough hands grabbed his wrists, pulling them behind his back. Cold metal handcuffs bit into his skin. We got him, one officer said into his radio. Male suspect apprehended on Cedar Drive. What's happening? Marcus's voice cracked. What did I do? No one answered. They hauled him to his feet and patted him down. Marcus caught glimpses of curtains twitching in nearby windows, faces peering out at the scene. Wallet? An officer demanded. Front pocket, Marcus whispered. They pulled out his student ID, his bus pass, and the $20 bill his mom had given him for emergencies. Marcus Johnson, 17. The officer read aloud. What were you doing in this neighborhood? Marcus. I was at the library. I'm just trying to get to the bus stop. The library closed an hour ago. I was studying outside. They have benches and Wi-Fi. Sure you were. The officer's tone dripped with skepticism. And I suppose you don't know anything about the robbery that just occurred 3 blocks from here. Marcus's stomach dropped. Robbery? No. I swear. I was just studying. Save it for the station. They pushed him into the back of a police car. Through the window, Marcus watched an officer pick up his scattered books. AP Calculus, SAT Prep, Constitutional Law. The officer's expression flickered for a moment, but he dropped them back on the ground. At the police station, they took his fingerprints and mugshot. The flash of the camera burned his eyes. They put him in an interrogation room, bare walls, metal table, uncomfortable chair. Hours passed. His requests to call his mother were ignored. Finally, the door opened. A detective entered, carrying a thin file. So, Marcus, the detective said, sitting down. Want to tell me what you were really doing in Oakwood Heights? I told the officers. I was studying at the library, on a bench outside the closed library, in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in town. The detective leaned forward. You expect me to believe that? It's the truth. My mom works there. She's a housekeeper for the Petersons on Maple Street. I sometimes study there while waiting for the bus because it's quiet and safe. Marcus's voice caught. At least, I thought it was safe. The detective pulled out some photos. A house was robbed this evening. Jewelry, cash, electronics, all gone. Witnesses saw a young black male running from the scene. That wasn't me. Check the library cameras. Check my books. I've been studying for my SATs. I have a scholarship interview next week. The door burst open. Marcus's mother stood there, still in her housekeeper's uniform, her face tight with worry and exhaustion. Marcus, baby, are you okay? Mom. She rushed to hug him, then turned to the detective. I'm Sharon Johnson, his mother. What's going on? Why wasn't I called immediately? Mrs. Johnson, your son was arrested in connection with a robbery. That's impossible. Marcus is a straight-A student. He's never been in trouble in his life. A man in a rumpled suit appeared in the doorway. I'm David Chen, from the Public Defender's Office. Mrs. Johnson, I'll be representing your son. Detective, any questioning stops now until I've had time to consult with my client. The detective gathered his photos. Fine, but he's being charged. Multiple witnesses placed someone matching his description at the scene. After the detective left, Mr. Chen sat down heavily. Marcus, I'll be honest. They're pushing for serious charges. breaking and entering, grand theft. But I didn't do anything. Marcus's voice broke. I believe you. But we're facing an uphill battle. The DA's office is under pressure to crack down on property crime in wealthy neighborhoods. They'll want to make an example of someone. Marcus's mother gripped his hand. What can we do? We'll fight it. But you need to be prepared. This could take months. And Marcus? Mr. Chen hesitated. You should know that colleges might rescind acceptance offers if you're convicted. Scholarship committees definitely will. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Everything he'd worked for, his perfect GPA, his SAT prep, his dreams of becoming a lawyer, could disappear because he'd chosen to study in the wrong neighborhood. They released him to his mother's custody at midnight. The ride home was silent. In his bedroom, Marcus couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the handcuffs cutting into his wrists, saw the officers' drawn weapons, heard the detective's accusatory tone. Around 3 a.m., his mother appeared in his doorway. Marcus, you awake? Yeah. She sat on the edge of his bed, like she used to do when he was little and had nightmares. I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry this happened to you. I should have listened when you told me not to study there. No. Her voice was firm. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. Remember what your grandfather always said. Marcus nodded. Keep your head high and your heart strong. That's right. We're going to fight this. Together. She squeezed his hand. Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. But sleep didn't come. Marcus lay awake, watching shadows move across his ceiling, wondering how studying for the SATs had turned into the worst night of his life. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. But tonight, in the darkness of his room, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his fear. The courthouse loomed over Marcus like a mountain of stone and steel. His dress shirt collar felt too tight, and the tie his mother had helped him knot seemed to be slowly strangling him. The morning sun hadn't yet burned away the fog, and the building shadow felt cold on his skin. Remember, Mr. Chen said, adjusting his own crooked tie. Let me do all the talking. This is just the initial hearing. Plead not guilty, request bail, go home. Simple. Nothing felt simple anymore. Marcus watched his mother check her phone again. She'd already missed 2 days of work because of this. The Petersons, her employers, had been understanding so far, but their patience wouldn't last forever. Inside, the metal detector beeped as Marcus walked through. The security guard made him do it twice more before letting him pass, even though Marcus had emptied his pockets completely. His mother's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The courtroom was already crowded. Marcus recognized faces from Oakwood Heights, the same faces that had watched from windows as police arrested him. They sat on the prosecution's side, whispering behind their hands. One woman clutched her purse tighter when Marcus walked past. All rise. The bailiff's voice boomed through the room. Everyone stood as a door opened behind the judge's bench. Marcus's heart pounded as he waited to see who would decide his fate. The judge was a woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Be seated, she said, adjusting her glasses. Case number 2024 CR 1857, State versus Marcus Johnson. The prosecutor stood, a tall man in an expensive suit. Andrew Phillips for the state. Your Honor. David Chen for the defense. The judge, her nameplate read Han. Sarah Matthews, nodded. Charges. Breaking and entering, grand theft. Your Honor, Phillips said. The state has strong evidence linking the defendant to a series of burglaries in Oakwood Heights. Series? Mr. Chen interrupted. The arrest report mentions only one incident. New evidence has come to light suggesting Mr. Johnson's involvement in similar crimes over the past month. Marcus's stomach lurched. His mother grabbed his hand under the table. Your Honor, Mr. Chen protested. This is the first we're hearing of these allegations. Mr. Phillips, Judge Matthews said, you'll provide the defense with all evidence immediately. Mr. Johnson, how do you plead? Marcus stood on shaking legs. Not guilty, Your Honor. Bail, Your Honor. Mr. Chen asked. My client is a minor with no prior record. He's a straight-A student with strong community ties. The state opposes bail. Phillips cut in. The defendant was caught fleeing the scene. He was walking to a bus stop, and the value of stolen items exceeds $50,000. Given the serious nature of these charges and the defendant's lack of financial resources, He poses a significant flight risk. Marcus felt the room spin. $50,000? He'd never even seen that much money. Judge Matthews studied the papers before her. Bail is set at $25,000. Mr. Chen's shoulders slumped. Even at 10%, that was more money than Marcus's family had. Next hearing set for 2 weeks from today. Mr. Phillips, I want that evidence on Mr. Chen's desk by tomorrow morning. Outside the courtroom, Marcus's mother pulled out her phone again. 3 missed calls from Mrs. Peterson. Her hands shook as she listened to the voicemail. Sharon, we need to talk. These accusations against Marcus, well, some jewelry went missing from our house last month. We didn't want to say anything, but now, call me back immediately. She clicked the phone off, her face ashen. Marcus. Mom, I swear I know. Baby. I know. But her voice wavered. Mr. Chen pulled them into an empty conference room. We need to talk strategy. The prosecution's building a bigger case than I expected. They'll try to pressure you into a plea deal. But I'm innocent. I believe you. But proving it won't be easy. They'll argue you used your mother's job to case these houses. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from his school counselor. Need to meet ASAP re. Princeton scholarship application. Everything was falling apart. The scholarship committee would withdraw his application. Princeton would rescind his early acceptance. All because he'd wanted a quiet place to study. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep again. He pulled out his grandfather's old watch, the only thing he'd inherited when Pop died last year. The inscription was worn but still readable. Keep your integrity, no matter the cost. His phone lit up with messages from classmates. Saw you on the news. That's messed up. My mom says we can't hang out anymore. Sorry. Did you really rob those houses? Marcus turned the phone off and lay in the darkness, listening to his mother cry in the next room. The next few days blurred together. Marcus's mother returned to work, but things had changed. Mrs. Peterson watched her constantly, following her from room to room. The other housekeepers stopped talking to her. Their neighbors crossed the street to avoid them. At school, Marcus sat alone at lunch. His teachers looked at him differently now. Only his calculus teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, still treated him normally. The principal wants to see you, she said after class one day, her eyes sympathetic. In the office, Principal Warner sat behind his desk, looking uncomfortable. Marcus, given the serious nature of the charges against you, the board feels it's best if you switch to remote learning until this is resolved. You're suspending me? But I haven't been convicted of anything. This is for your own good. Some parents have expressed concerns. Marcus walked home in a daze. The scholarship interview was tomorrow. He'd prepared for months. But how could he face the committee now? His phone buzzed again. Another text from his mother. Coming home late. Mrs. Peterson making me reorganize entire house. Says things still missing. I love you. He stopped at his grandfather's grave on the way home. The cemetery was quiet except for distant traffic. I don't know what to do. Pop, he whispered. Everything's falling apart. Maybe I should just take a plea deal if they offer one. Get it over with. The wind rustled through nearby trees. Marcus remembered sitting on his grandfather's lap as a child, listening to stories about the civil rights movement, about standing up for truth even when the whole world seemed against you. Keep your integrity, no matter the cost. Marcus stood up, brushing grass from his knees. Tomorrow would bring the scholarship interview, more accusations, more suspicious looks. But he wouldn't break. He couldn't. His mother was home when he arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with unopened bills spread before her. How was your day? She asked, trying to smile. Principal Warner suspended me. She closed her eyes briefly. We'll appeal it. Add it to the list. Mom, I'm sorry. About everything. Don't you dare apologize. Her voice sharpened. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. But her hands trembled as she sorted the bills, and Marcus noticed new gray hairs at her temples that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. That night, he dreamed of courtrooms and jail cells, of Princeton acceptance letters burning to ash, of his mother crying alone in empty houses. He woke gasping, his grandfather's words echoing in his mind. Keep your integrity, no matter the cost. But as Marcus stared at his dark ceiling, he wondered, how high would that cost be? And how many people would have to pay it with him? The scholarship interview had gone as badly as Marcus expected. The committee members had been polite but distant, their eyes constantly drifting to the ankle monitor he now wore. His chances at Princeton were slipping away, just like everything else. 2 weeks had passed, and now he was back in the courthouse for the preliminary hearing. The same security guard made him go through the metal detector 3 times again. The same whispers followed him down the hallway. But something felt different today. "Remember," Mr. Chen said, straightening Marcus's tie, "Judge Matthews is known for being tough but fair. She'll actually look at the evidence, not just rubber stamp whatever the prosecution wants." Sharon Johnson sat beside her son, her work uniform hidden under a borrowed blazer. She'd had to beg Mrs. Peterson for the morning off. "All rise." The courtroom stood as Judge Matthews entered. Marcus watched her arrange her papers, put on her reading glasses, take them off again. Her hands moved quickly, almost nervously. "Be seated," she said. "State versus Marcus Johnson." That's when it happened. Judge Matthews looked up, directly at Marcus. Her hands froze mid-motion. The reading glasses slipped from her fingers, clattering on the bench. The bailiff stepped forward. "Your Honor." For a long moment, Judge Matthews just stared at Marcus. Her face had gone pale, and her hands were visibly shaking. "Your Honor," the prosecutor prompted. "Shall we proceed?" Judge Matthews blinked rapidly. "Aye. We'll take a brief recess." 15 minutes. She stood abruptly, almost knocking over her water glass. "Court is in recess." She practically fled the courtroom. Confused murmurs filled the air. "What just happened?" Marcus whispered to Mr. Chen. The lawyer shook his head. "I've never seen her like that." Marcus noticed the prosecutor, Mr. Phillips, watching the judge's exit with narrowed eyes. He was already reaching for his phone. In the hallway, Marcus's mother squeezed his hand. "Maybe it's a good sign. Maybe she saw something in the case files." "Mrs. Johnson." A court clerk approached them. "Judge Matthews would like to see you and your son in her chambers." Immediately, Phillips shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I must object." With counsel present, of course, the clerk added smoothly. The judge's chambers were smaller than Marcus expected, with walls lined with law books and framed photographs he couldn't quite make out. Judge Matthews stood at her window, still looking shaken. "Your Honor," Phillips started, "this is highly irregular. Sit down, Mr. Phillips." Her voice was quiet but firm. She turned to face them, her eyes fixed on Marcus. "I need to ask you something. Your grandfather, was his name William Johnson?" Marcus sat up straighter. "Yes." "How did you? Did he work as a janitor at Central High School in the 1990s? "Yes, until he retired in 2012. Judge Matthews sank into her chair. "I knew it. I knew I recognized something about you." She pulled a framed photo from her desk drawer, hands still trembling slightly. This was taken in 1994. The photo showed a much younger Sarah Matthews, probably in her early 20s, standing next to Marcus's grandfather. They were both smiling in front of Central High. "I don't understand," Phillips said. "What does this have to do with?" "Your grandfather saved my life," Judge Matthews said quietly, ignoring Phillips. "Did he ever tell you about the girl he found in the chemistry lab after hours?" Marcus shook his head. "I was a student teacher, staying late to grade papers. There was a fire in one of the labs, faulty wiring. The smoke was so thick I couldn't find the door. I would have died if William hadn't." She took a deep breath. "He ran into that smoke without hesitation. Carried me out." "That sounds like Pop-Pop," Marcus's mother said softly. "He never talked about it. Though. He wouldn't. He was the most humble man I've ever known. And the most honest." Judge Matthews looked directly at Marcus. "Which is why I need to recuse myself from this case." "Your Honor," Phillips protested. "The state objects. You can object all you want, Mr. Phillips. I cannot be impartial in this case. Not when I owe my life to this young man's grandfather. Not when I know the kind of man William Johnson was, and the kind of values he would have instilled in his family. All due respect, Your Honor. But the evidence is circumstantial at best, and you know it." Judge Matthews's voice hardened. "Multiple witnesses saw a young black male running in a neighborhood where dozens of young black men work as gardeners, delivery drivers, and maintenance workers. A partial fingerprint that could match several thousand people. And now these mysterious additional burglaries, conveniently discovered after the arrest." Phillips's face reddened. "The state has more evidence. Then you can present it to Judge Rodriguez. She'll take over the case effective immediately." Judge Matthews stood. "But before I go, Mr. Phillips, I strongly suggest you review your evidence. All of it. Because if I find out you've been pursuing charges based on racial profiling and community pressure. She let the threat hang in the air. The prosecutor gathered his papers quickly and left. Mr. Chen was grinning. Thank you, Your Honor, he said. Will you be making a statement about why you're recusing yourself? Only that I have a personal connection to the family that prevents me from being impartial. She turned to Marcus. I wish I could do more. Your grandfather, he was a great man. The day he pulled me from that fire, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, sometimes doing the right thing means walking through smoke. Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. It sounded exactly like something Pop would say. He was so proud of you, his mother said suddenly. He used to show everyone your report cards, tell them you were going to be a lawyer someday. Judge Matthews smiled. William always could spot potential. He's the one who encouraged me to go to law school. She picked up the photo again. I visited him every year at Christmas. The last time I saw him, he was talking about his grandson who wanted to study constitutional law. Marcus remembered that Christmas. He'd been too busy studying for midterms to join the family dinner. If he'd known it would be Pop's last. I have to go, Judge Matthews said. The court administrator is probably having a fit about the delay. But Marcus. She met his eyes. Keep your head high. The truth has a way of coming out. Back in the courtroom, Judge Matthews officially recused herself. The remaining proceedings were postponed until Judge Rodriguez could take over. As they left the courthouse, Marcus noticed Phillips huddled with his team, looking worried. What happens now? Marcus asked Mr. Chen. Now things get interesting. Judge Matthews just put the DA's office on notice. They'll have to actually prove their case, not just rely on assumptions and prejudices. But will Judge Rodriguez be as understanding? Carmen Rodriguez is tough but fair, and she hates sloppy prosecution work even more than Judge Matthews does. Mr. Chen smiled. I'd say today was a good day. Marcus wasn't so sure. They'd gotten lucky with Judge Matthews. But how many more obstacles lay ahead? How many more people would assume his guilt based on nothing but his skin color and presence in the wrong neighborhood? His mother hugged him tightly outside the courthouse. Your grandfather's watching over you, she whispered. I know he is. Marcus touched the old watch in his pocket. Maybe she was right. Maybe Pop was still looking out for him, still fighting for justice in his own way. But as they walked to the bus stop, Marcus couldn't help noticing how people still crossed the street to avoid them, how suspicious glances followed their every move. One lucky break wouldn't change centuries of prejudice. The real battle was just beginning. The projector hummed in the darkened courtroom. Judge Rodriguez, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, leaned forward as the grainy security footage began to play. As you can see, Your Honor, Phillips said, pointing to a shadowy figure moving across the screen. The suspect approaches the Henderson residence at 6:47 p.m. Marcus gripped the edge of his chair. The figure was barely visible, just a dark shape against darker shadows. The footage was damaged, full of static and jumping frames. Objection, Mr. Chen called out. The quality of this video is too poor to identify anyone. Overruled, Judge Rodriguez said. But noted. Continue, Mr. Phillips. The prosecutor smiled. We've enhanced several key frames. If you'll direct your attention to Exhibit B. A still image appeared on screen. The figure was closer now, but the face was just a blur of pixels. The suspect matches the defendant's height, build, and clothing description perfectly. That could be anyone, Mr. Chen protested. The figure is practically a silhouette. We have witness testimony to corroborate. The courtroom doors burst open. A man in a security guard uniform hurried in, whispering something to Phillips. The prosecutor's face tightened. Your Honor, may we approach? Judge Rodriguez waved them forward. Marcus watched their backs, straining to hear the whispered conversation. Mr. Chen returned looking troubled. Your Honor, the defense requests a brief recess. Granted. 15 minutes. In a conference room, Mr. Chen paced. The security company just found more footage. From a different angle. Is that good? Marcus's mother asked. I don't know. They are processing it now. But Phillips seemed rattled. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from his former best friend James. Everyone at school talking about your case. This is messed up. He turned the phone off. He couldn't deal with that right now. Back in the courtroom, Phillips called his first witness. Please state your name for the record. Karen Henderson. Mrs. Henderson looked exactly like Marcus remembered her from the neighborhood. Expensive clothes, carefully styled hair, nervous eyes that wouldn't quite meet his. Mrs. Henderson, please tell the court what you saw on the evening of March 15th. She cleared her throat. I was in my home office, overlooking the street. I saw a young man, she glanced at Marcus, running past my house. A few minutes later, I heard about the robbery. And is that young man in the courtroom today? I think so. It looked like him, but it was getting dark. Let the record show the witness identified the defendant. Objection. Mr. Chen stood. The witness said she thinks she saw someone who looked like my client. That's hardly a positive identification. The witness can elaborate during cross-examination, Judge Rodriguez said. Continue. Phillips pulled out more photos. Mrs. Henderson, did you notice anything unusual in the days before the robbery? Well, yes. I saw the same young man walking through the neighborhood several times that week. Always carrying a backpack. Always looking at the houses. Marcus wanted to scream. He'd been studying, looking for a quiet spot with good Wi-Fi. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. Phillips turned to the judge. The state would like to enter new evidence. Security footage from other homes in the neighborhood shows the defendant casing potential targets in the weeks leading up to. Objection. Mr. Chen slammed his hand on the table. This is the first we're hearing of this footage. The prosecution is required to share all evidence. The footage was only discovered this morning. Your Honor, Mr. Chen's voice rose. This is a clear violation of discovery rules. Judge Rodriguez's eyes narrowed. Mr. Phillips, you know better. Where is this alleged new footage? Being processed, Your Honor. We can have it ready by tomorrow. Then you can present it tomorrow, after the defense has had time to review it. She turned to Mrs. Henderson. You may step down. Mr. Chen, your witness. Mr. Chen approached the stand. Mrs. Henderson, you said you saw someone running past your house. What time was this? Around 6:45, I think. You think? Were you watching the time? Well, no. But, could it have been earlier? Say, 6:30. She hesitated. Maybe. The library closes at 6 o'clock, and the bus stop is a 15-minute walk away. If someone was leaving the library, they might pass your house around 6:30. Correct? I suppose. And you said you saw this person several times that week. Always with a backpack. Correct. Yes. Did you know that Mrs. Johnson, who works as a housekeeper in your neighborhood, has a son who studies at the library while waiting for his bus? Mrs. Henderson's face flushed. No, I didn't. So you saw a young black man with a backpack and assumed he was casing houses? Did you ever consider he might be a student? Objection. Phillips called. Argumentative. Sustained. Watch your tone, Mr. Chen. The defense lawyer nodded. One more question, Mrs. Henderson. In your initial statement to police, you said you wasn't sure about the identification. What made you change your mind? She twisted her hands in her lap. Well, after talking to the other neighbors, and when the police said they were sure. No further questions. The next witness was Officer Burke, one of the arresting officers. He testified about finding Marcus fleeing the scene. The suspect was running, walking, Mr. Chen corrected. Your own body camera footage shows him walking, moving away from the crime scene, Burke amended. When ordered to stop, he appeared nervous. Because you approached him with weapons drawn. Objection, Phillips said. Counsel is testifying. Sustained. The day dragged on. More witnesses described seeing someone in the neighborhood. None could positively identify Marcus. The security footage played again and again, each viewing showing nothing but shadows and static. During a break, Marcus overheard Phillips arguing with someone on his phone. What do you mean it doesn't match? Process it again. No, we need that footage. Find something. Mr. Chen was smiling. The new footage isn't helping their case, I think. But Marcus couldn't celebrate. Mrs. Peterson had called his mother during lunch. More jewelry was missing. The accusations were getting worse, not better. The final witness of the day was Marcus's school principal, Mr. Warner. Please tell the court about Mr. Johnson's disciplinary record. Marcus sat up straighter. What disciplinary record? In his freshman year, there was an incident. A student's phone went missing from the locker room. Marcus was in the area at the time. Was he charged? No. The phone was found later. It had fallen behind a bench. But you still keep that incident in his file. 3 years later. Warner shifted uncomfortably. It's standard procedure. Any other incidents? No. Marcus's was one of our top students. The day ended with a bombshell. Phillips stood, looking uncomfortable. Your Honor, regarding the new security footage, it appears there were some technical issues. The footage is unavailable. Judge Rodriguez's expression could have frozen hell. Unavailable. Corrupted during processing. We're trying to recover. Enough. The judge's voice was ice. Mr. Phillips, in my chambers. Now. As they filed out of the courtroom, Marcus caught snippets of conversation from the gallery. The footage probably showed someone else. They're hiding something. But if he's innocent, why was he there? His mother squeezed his hand. It's going better. They don't have real evidence. But Marcus wasn't sure it mattered. In the eyes of Oakwood Heights, he was already guilty. The truth seemed less important than what people wanted to believe. That night, he dreamed of security cameras watching his every move, their red lights blinking like accusatory eyes. In the dream, he tried to show them his library books, his student ID, his hopes and dreams. But the cameras only saw what they wanted to see. A shadow, a threat, a criminal. He woke up wondering if the truth would ever be enough. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the small conference room. Marcus stared at the paper in front of him, the words blurring together. 6 months. That's what the plea deal offered. 6 months in juvenile detention instead of the potential 5 years if he was tried as an adult. It's a good deal, Phillips said, his tie loosened after hours of negotiation. All you have to do is plead guilty to 1 count of breaking and entering. The theft charges disappear. Mr. Chen sat silent beside Marcus, his face unreadable. Sharon Johnson gripped her son's hand under the table. How long do I have to decide? Marcus's voice cracked. 24 hours. Phillips gathered his papers. But the deal expires after that. Think carefully, Marcus. Your future's at stake. After he left, Mr. Chen finally spoke. It's your decision, Marcus. But you should know, they're offering this deal because their case is weak. That missing security footage? I have a contact at the security company. It showed someone else entirely. Then why don't they release it? Politics. The DA's office is under pressure from wealthy donors in Oakwood Heights. They want a conviction. Any conviction. Marcus pulled out his grandfather's watch, running his thumb over the worn inscription. What would you do? I can't answer that. But I can tell you this. A guilty plea follows you forever. Even juvenile records can be accessed by colleges, employers, anyone who digs deep enough. His mother's phone buzzed. Another text from Mrs. Peterson. She'd been sending them constantly, each one more accusatory than the last. I have to get back to work, she said, standing. Baby, whatever you decide. I know. Mom. Alone in the conference room, Marcus closed his eyes. Pop-Pop's voice echoed in his memory, from a day long ago when Marcus had been caught in a lie about breaking a window. Truth ain't always easy, boy. But a lie eats at your soul. The window had been an accident, a baseball thrown too hard. Pop-Pop had helped him confess, then worked all summer to pay for the replacement. Marcus's phone lit up with a text from his counselor. Princeton wants an update on your situation. What should I tell them? He turned the phone off. 6 months. He could survive 6 months, right? Then it would all be over. The door opened. Judge Matthews stood there, looking uncertain. I shouldn't be here, she said. But I had to. I knew your grandfather, Marcus. The idea of his grandson pleading guilty to something he didn't do. It would break his heart. You don't know I didn't do it. Yes, I do. Because I knew William Johnson. And I see him in you. She sat down. Did you know he was once offered a similar deal? Marcus sat up straighter. What? 1975. He was accused of stealing from the school where he worked as a janitor. They offered him a deal. Resigned quietly, no charges filed. But he refused. Fought it all the way. What happened? The Real thief was caught 2 months later. Another janitor who'd been planting evidence to frame your grandfather. She leaned forward. William lost his job, his reputation, everything. But he never gave up on the truth. That's different. He was innocent. So are you. Judge Matthews stood. I really shouldn't have come, but I owed it to William. Whatever you decide, Marcus, make sure you can live with it. She left Marcus alone with his thoughts. The conference room felt smaller, the air heavier. His mother would support him either way. Mr. Chen would understand. 6 months wasn't that long. The door opened again. This time it was Mrs. Rodriguez, his calculus teacher. "Marcus, may I come in?" He nodded, surprised. She sat across from him, placing a folder on the table. "Your last test," she said. "You aced it. Even with everything going on, you're still my best student. Felt lot of good that does me now. It means everything. It means you're still you, still fighting." She opened the folder. "I've been doing some calculations of my own. The prosecution's timeline doesn't add up. If you left the library when they claim, you physically couldn't have been at the crime scene when. Mrs. Rodriguez, why are you here?" She paused. "Because 18 years ago, my brother faced a similar choice. He took the plea deal. 6 months seemed better than 5 years." Her eyes grew distant. He's never forgiven himself. The guilty plea cost him his dreams, his self-respect. He's still paying for that choice. Marcus looked at his grandfather's watch again. The second hand ticked steadily, each movement bringing him closer to a decision that would define his life. His phone buzzed again. Reluctantly, he turned it on. A message from James, his former best friend. "Hey, I know we haven't talked, but I saw you that day. At the library. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry." Marcus's hands shook as he typed back. "What time did you see me?" The response came quickly, around 6:30. "You were at your usual spot under the oak tree. The time of the robbery." An alibi. The conference room door opened one last time. His mother stood there, still in her housekeeper's uniform. "I quit," she said simply. "Mom, no. Mrs. Peterson accused me of helping you rob houses. Said she'd call the police if any more jewelry went missing." She sat beside him. "I've spent 15 years cleaning other people's homes, keeping quiet when they treated me like I was invisible. But I won't stand by while they try to destroy my son." Marcus stared at the plea agreement. 6 months of freedom for a lifetime of guilt. A quick escape that would haunt him forever. "Pop used to say something," his mother continued softly. "A lie might set you free, but the truth lets you live with yourself." Marcus picked up the plea agreement. The paper felt heavy in his hands, like it was weighted with all his fears, all his dreams, all his grandfather's hopes for him. Slowly, deliberately, he tore it in half. "Call Mr. Chen," he said. "Tell him I want to testify." His mother hugged him, tears in her eyes. "Your grandfather would be so proud." Outside the conference room, the courthouse bustled with activity. Marcus heard snippets of conversation. "Did you hear? The security company whistleblower. Someone else in the footage. The DA's office is in damage control." But none of it mattered now. He'd chosen his path. Like his grandfather before him, he'd walked through the smoke to reach the truth. That night, for the first time since his arrest, Marcus slept soundly. In his dreams, he saw Pop smiling, heard his voice as clearly as if he was still alive. "Keep your integrity, no matter the cost." The cost would be high. The fight would be hard. But Marcus Johnson would face it as himself. Not a convicted criminal, not a convenient scapegoat, but his grandfather's grandson, standing tall in the light of truth. The witness stand felt like an island in a sea of hostile faces. Marcus adjusted his tie, his father's tie, the only one they owned, and placed his hand on the Bible. The courtroom lights seemed too bright, too harsh. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do." His voice came out stronger than he expected. Mr. Chen approached, his manner gentle. "Please state your name for the record." "Marcus William Johnson. Named after your grandfather." "Yes, sir." "Marcus, can you tell the court where you were on the evening of March 15th? Marcus took a deep breath. They'd practiced this, but now every word felt weighted with his future. "I was at the public library on Oak Street. I study there most evenings while waiting for the bus home." "Why that particular library?" "There's one closer to your home. The Oak Street branch has better Wi-Fi, and—" He hesitated. "It's quieter, easier to focus, and it's in Oakwood Heights, where your mother works." "Yes. She cleans houses there. Sometimes she gives me rides home if she finishes early." "What were you studying that evening?" "SAT Prep and AP Calculus." "I had a scholarship interview coming up." "Had?" They suspended my application when I was arrested." Mr. Chen nodded sympathetically. Walk us through that evening. I was at my usual spot, under the oak tree near the library's west wall. They have outdoor tables there, and the Wi-Fi still works. I studied until about 6:30, then packed up to catch the 6:45 bus. Why study outside when the library was closed? The building closes at 6, but I needed more study time. The outdoor spot is well lit, and he swallowed hard. I felt safe there. Or I used to. What happened as you walked to the bus stop? Police cars surrounded me. Officers jumped out with guns drawn. His voice cracked. They threw me to the ground. Wouldn't let me explain. Wouldn't let me call my mom. Did you ever enter the Henderson residence? No, sir. Did you take anything from their home? No, sir. Thank you, Marcus. No further questions. Phillips stood slowly, adjusting his tie. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Johnson, you claim you were studying. Where are these study materials now? The police took my backpack when they arrested me. My books scattered on the sidewalk. Convenient. And you say someone saw you at the library? My friend James. Ah, yes. This friend who conveniently remembered seeing you after months of silence. Why didn't he come forward sooner? Marcus gripped the witness stand. You'd have to ask him. Let's talk about your relationship with the Petersons, your mother's employers. Objection. Mr. Chen called. Relevance goes to motive. Your Honor, I'll allow it, Judge Rodriguez said. Briefly. Phillips paced before the stand. You've been to their house many times, haven't you? Sometimes I wait there for my mom to finish work. So you know the layout, the security system, the valuable items inside. Marcus felt heat rise in his face. I never. And when items started disappearing, your mother lost her job, didn't she? She quit. Because Mrs. Peterson accused her of helping you steal. Objection. Mr. Chen shot to his feet. The witness's mother is not on trial here. Sustained. Move on, Mr. Phillips. The prosecutor changed tactics. Let's discuss your previous incident with theft. Marcus's stomach dropped. The freshman year locker room incident. That phone was found. I never took anything, but you were suspected. Just like you were suspected of cheating on a test in 7th grade. Objection. Prior unproven allegations. Sustained. Judge Rodriguez's voice sharpened. Mr. Phillips, stay focused on the current charges. But the damage was done. Marcus saw the jury exchanging glances, saw the doubt in their eyes. You claim you were studying for the SATs, Phillips continued. Preparing for Princeton. Big dreams for someone from your background. The courtroom temperature seemed to drop. Even the jury looked uncomfortable. My background. Marcus's voice was quiet. Your economic situation. Your neighborhood. Surely the wealth in Oakwood Heights must have been tempting. No. Marcus sat straighter. My grandfather taught me. Ah, yes, your grandfather. The janitor. The one Judge Matthews mysteriously knew. Objection. Mr. Chen's voice boomed. Counsel is badgering the witness and making inflammatory statements about a respected judge. Sustained. Judge Rodriguez glared at Phillips. That's enough. But Marcus had had enough too. Months of fear and anger boiled over. My grandfather was a better man than you'll ever be, he said, voice shaking. He taught me that character matters more than money. That truth matters more than what people assume about you because of your skin color or your job or your background. Mr. Johnson, Phillips started. I was studying for Princeton because I earned it. Because I worked harder than anyone else. Because my grandfather taught me that education is the one thing no one can take from you. Marcus's voice grew stronger. I didn't steal anything. I don't need to. I have something worth more than anything in those houses. I have integrity. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Rodriguez made no move to stop him. You want to talk about my background? My background is a mother who works 2 jobs to support me. A grandfather who taught me right from wrong. Teachers who believed in me. I don't need to steal to get ahead. I just need people to see me for who I am, not what they assume I must be. Tears streamed down his mother's face in the gallery. Mr. Chen was smiling. Phillips rallied. Very moving. But it doesn't change the evidence. What evidence? Marcus demanded. A blurry video? Witnesses who think they saw someone who looked like me? Timestamps that don't match? Or are we just talking about the color of my skin and the neighborhood I was in? Your Honor, Phillips protested weakly. You want to know why I study in that neighborhood? Because it's quiet. Because it's safe. Because I thought if I worked hard enough, played by the rules, I could prove that assumptions about people like me are wrong. Marcus took a shuddering breath. I guess I was wrong about that last part. Judge Rodriguez leaned forward. Mr. Phillips, do you have any relevant questions for this witness? The prosecutor shuffled his papers. No further questions. Redirect. Mr. Chen. Marcus's lawyer stood. Just one question. Marcus, if you could say something to the people who accused you, what would it be? Marcus looked out at the courtroom. At Mrs. Henderson, who wouldn't meet his eyes. At the other witnesses who'd been so sure of what they'd seen. At Phillips, who'd tried to break him. I'd say I'm not what you think I am. I'm not your assumption or your fear or your prejudice. I'm just a kid who wanted to study somewhere quiet. Who dreamed of Princeton. Who believed that if he worked hard and told the truth, justice would win. He touched his grandfather's watch. Maybe I was naive. But I'd rather be naive than be what you think I am. No further questions, Mr. Chen said softly. As Marcus left the witness stand on shaking legs, he heard murmurs from the gallery. But for the first time since his arrest, he walked with his head high. His mother hugged him fiercely. Your grandfather would be so proud. Marcus wasn't sure about that. But he knew one thing. He was proud of himself. Whatever happened next, he'd spoken his truth. The day ended with Judge Rodriguez calling both attorneys to her chambers. Through the door, Marcus heard raised voices. Phillips emerged looking shaken. We reconvene tomorrow, the judge announced. Court is adjourned. Outside, reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Marcus ignored them all. You did good, kid, Mr. Chen said. Really good. But Marcus barely heard him. He was thinking about his grandfather, about integrity, about truth. About smoke and fire and doing the right thing even when it burns. Tomorrow would bring the verdict. But tonight, Marcus Johnson would sleep knowing he'd faced the fire and emerged unburned, his integrity intact. Judge Rodriguez's chambers buzzed with tension. The morning sun slanted through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across a desk. Marcus sat between his mother and Mr. Chen, watching the judge review a thick stack of papers. Mr. Phillips, her voice could have frozen fire. Would you care to explain this? The prosecutor shifted in his chair. Your Honor, I can assure you, because it looks to me like your office deliberately suppressed evidence. She held up a report. The security company's full analysis, dated the day after Mr. Johnson's arrest, shows the suspect in the footage was at least 6 inches shorter than the defendant. Phillips loosened his tie. That report was preliminary. And this? She lifted another document. Library Wi-Fi logs showing a device matching Mr. Johnson's phone connected continuously from 4:30 to 6:30 p.m. on the day in question. We weren't aware. Oh, it gets better. Judge Rodriguez's voice dripped acid. Multiple witness statements contradicting your timeline. Evidence of similar burglaries continuing after Mr. Johnson's arrest. And most interesting of all, a police report from 2 days ago about stolen jewelry found in the possession of the Petersons' gardener. Sharon Johnson gasped. Marcus felt lightheaded. Your Honor, Phillips started. We're prepared to drop all charges. Drop the charges. Judge Rodriguez's laugh held no humor. Oh, we're well past that, Mr. Phillips. I want every document related to this case on my desk by noon. Every email, every text, every scrap of paper. I'm ordering a full investigation into your office's handling of this matter. That's not necessary. I think it is. Because either your office is criminally incompetent, or you deliberately prosecuted an innocent young man to appease wealthy donors. I'm not sure which is worse. Mr. Chen spoke up. Your Honor, given these developments, we move for immediate dismissal of all charges. Granted. With prejudice. She turned to Marcus. Mr. Johnson, you're free to go. I'm sorry for what you've endured. Outside the chambers, reporters crowded the hallway. News of the dismissal had spread fast. Marcus, how does it feel to be cleared? Will you sue the DA's office? Any comment on racial profiling in Oakwood Heights? Mr. Chen shielded them from the cameras. No questions. My client's been through enough. But one voice cut through the chaos. Marcus, can we talk? It was Mrs. Henderson, looking smaller without her usual confident pose. Her eyes were red. I need to apologize. I was so sure about what I saw, but I only saw what I expected to see. What I was afraid of seeing. She twisted her hands together, I'm so sorry. Marcus studied her face. A month ago, her testimony had nearly destroyed his life. Now she looked lost, broken by her own prejudice. Thank you, he said simply. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. More revelations came throughout the day. The gardener had confessed to multiple burglaries. The security company released a statement about pressure from the DA's office to alter evidence. Phillips was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Marcus's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. From the Princeton admissions office, please contact us regarding your application status. From his school principal, your suspension is lifted. We hope to see you Monday. From James, you did it, bro. Never doubted you. But the message that hit hardest came from Mrs. Rodriguez, his calculus teacher. Your grandfather would be proud. So am I. At home, Marcus and his mother sat in their small kitchen, trying to process everything. The Petersons called, she said. They want me back. Offered a raise. What did you say? I told them I'd rather clean gas station bathrooms, she smiled. Already got 2 new clients. Better pay. Better hours, and they don't follow me around assuming I'm stealing. Marcus touched his grandfather's watch. Pop always said dignity matters more than dollars. That he did. She squeezed his hand. Speaking of dignity, Judge Matthews called. She wants to meet tomorrow. The next morning, they found the judge in her chambers, surrounded by newspapers. Every headline screamed about the case. DA's office under investigation in wrongful prosecution, racial profiling scandal rocks Oakwood Heights, teen's wrong arrest exposes systemic bias. Quite a storm you've kicked up, Judge Matthews said. But she was smiling. How are you holding up? Still processing, Marcus admitted. Everything's happening so fast. That's why I called you here. I have a proposition. She leaned forward. The State Bar Association is launching a mentorship program for minority students interested in law. They need someone to speak about their experiences with the justice system. Someone who can put a face to the statistics. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. You want me to turn this nightmare into something positive. To help make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. She pulled out a business card. The program includes a college scholarship. His mother squeezed his arm. That's wonderful. It's not Princeton, Judge Matthews cautioned. But it's a full ride to state, with guaranteed admission to the law school if you maintain your grades. Marcus stared at the card. A path forward. A way to fight the system from within. There's more, the judge continued. The ACLU wants to file a civil rights lawsuit. Not just against the DA's office, but against the entire system that allowed this to happen. They need a plaintiff. I don't know. Marcus hesitated. Won't that make it harder to move on? Sometimes moving on means making sure others don't have to go through what you did. Judge Matthews touched the photo of his grandfather on her desk. William taught me that. Outside her chambers, Marcus and his mother walked slowly through the courthouse. The same corridors that had once felt suffocating now seemed different. Not friendly, exactly, but navigable. A space he could learn to move through with purpose. What are you thinking? His mother asked. Marcus watched lawyers hurry past, carrying briefcases and files. A month ago, they'd all looked like enemies. Now he saw them differently, as players in a game he was starting to understand. I'm thinking about what Pop used to say about smoke. She smiled. That sometimes you have to walk through it to get to the truth. Yeah. Marcus straightened his shoulders. Maybe it's time for me to help others find their way through. His phone buzzed with another message from Princeton. For the first time since his arrest, Marcus didn't feel a pang of loss. Some doors had closed, yes, but others were opening, doors that led to different kinds of justice, different ways of changing the world. He thought about Mrs. Henderson's apology, about the faces in the courtroom when his innocence was proven. Small changes, maybe, but change had to start somewhere. You know what else Pop used to say? His mother asked. What's that? Truth is like water. It finds its way out, no matter how hard they try to contain it. Marcus touched his grandfather's watch one last time. The inscription caught the light. Keep your integrity, no matter the cost. The cost had been high. But as he walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, Marcus Johnson knew it had been worth it. The truth had found its way out. And now, maybe, he could help others find their way to justice too. The main courtroom was packed. Every bench filled, people standing along the walls. News cameras clustered outside, barred from entering but hungry for the story. Judge Rodriguez had called a special session to address the findings of her investigation. Marcus sat in the front row between his mother and Mr. Chen. Behind them, he sensed rather than saw the faces from Oakwood Heights. The witnesses who'd been so sure of his guilt, now forced to confront their mistakes. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff called out, "All rise." Judge Rodriguez entered, carrying a thick folder. Her face gave nothing away as she took a seat. "Be seated." She adjusted her microphone. "This court has completed its investigation into the prosecution of Marcus Johnson. The findings are disturbing." She opened the folder. "We have discovered multiple instances of prosecutorial misconduct, evidence suppression, and what can only be described as systemic bias in the handling of this case." Phillips sat at the prosecution table, head bowed. Two other lawyers from the DA's office flanked him, their faces tense. The investigation revealed that the district attorney's office received the exculpatory security footage analysis within 24 hours of Mr. Johnson's arrest. They chose to bury it. They received witness statements contradicting their timeline. They buried those too. Murmurs filled the courtroom. Judge Rodriguez raised her voice slightly. But perhaps most disturbing is the evidence of direct pressure from wealthy donors to secure a conviction, any conviction, to send a message about crime in Oakwood Heights. She lifted a stack of papers. "I have here emails between the DA's office and certain community leaders. Emails discussing the need to make an example of someone. Emails specifically mentioning the defendant's race as a factor in prosecution." The murmurs grew louder. Marcus's mother gripped his hand. "Mr. Phillips." The judge's voice cracked like a whip. "Do you have anything to say before this court rules on sanctions?" The prosecutor stood slowly. "Your Honor, He cleared his throat. "There's no excuse. I failed in my duty as an officer of the court. I failed in my duty to justice." "Yes, you did." Judge Rodriguez's voice could have frozen fire. "You also failed a 17-year-old boy whose only crime was studying while black in the wrong neighborhood." She turned to address the full courtroom. "This case represents everything wrong with our justice system. Racial profiling, prosecutorial misconduct, community pressure to convict regardless of evidence. A system more concerned with appearances than truth." Marcus watched faces in the gallery. Some looked ashamed, others angry. A few nodded in agreement. "Therefore, this court orders the following. First, all charges against Marcus Johnson are dismissed with prejudice. His record will be expunged immediately." Mr. Chen smiled. This was expected, but still good to hear officially. "Second, I am referring Mr. Phillips and two other prosecutors to the State Bar Association for disciplinary action. Their conduct in this case represents gross violations of professional ethics." Phillips slumped in his chair. "Third, I am ordering a complete review of all cases handled by this office in the past 5 years where racial bias may have played a role in prosecution." The other DA lawyers exchanged alarmed looks. "Fourth, I am recommending that the Department of Justice open a civil rights investigation into systemic bias in this jurisdiction's handling of criminal cases." The murmurs turned to gasps. And finally, Judge Rodriguez's voice softened slightly as she turned to Marcus. "I want to address Mr. Johnson directly." Marcus stood, his legs trembling slightly. "Young man, this court owes you an apology. The system meant to protect justice instead perpetrated injustice. You were judged not by evidence, not by character, but by prejudice and assumption." She paused, making eye contact with him. "But through it all, you maintained your dignity, your integrity. You chose truth over expediency, principle over convenience. In doing so, you exposed problems that have festered too long in our justice system." Tears streamed down Sharon Johnson's face. Mr. Chen beamed like a proud father. "Your grandfather once said that sometimes doing the right thing means walking through smoke. You've done more than walk through smoke, Mr. Johnson. You've helped clear it away so others might see justice more clearly." Marcus felt his own eyes growing wet. "This court thanks you for your courage, your dignity, and your unwavering commitment to truth. You've reminded us that justice is not just a concept but a sacred duty that must be fought for every day." She turned back to address the full courtroom. "Let this case serve as a warning and a wake-up call. The days of selective justice are over. The days of assuming guilt based on race are over. The days of letting wealth and influence pervert justice are over." She lifted her gavel. "This court stands adjourned." The bang of the gavel echoed like thunder. Outside, reporters swarmed them. Marcus, how do you feel about the ruling? Will you pursue civil action? What message do you have for other young men in your situation? Mr. Chen tried to shield them, but Marcus touched his arm. It's okay, he said. I want to speak. The cameras turned to him. Microphones thrust forward. I'm grateful for Judge Rodriguez's ruling. But this was never just about me. It's about every person who's been judged by their skin color instead of their character. Every person who's been assumed guilty until proven innocent, if they get the chance to prove their innocence at all. His voice grew stronger. I was lucky. I had people fighting for me. I had evidence that couldn't be completely buried. I had a judge brave enough to look past assumptions and demand truth. But what about those who don't have these advantages? The reporters scribbled frantically. My grandfather taught me that justice isn't just a word. It's something you have to stand up for. Fight for. Sometimes suffer for. Today's ruling is a start, but it's only a start. The real work begins now, a reporter called out. What work is that? Changing minds, changing hearts, changing a system that too often sees color before character, assumption before truth. It won't be easy. Change never is. But as my grandfather used to say, sometimes you have to walk through smoke to get to justice. Later, in Judge Matthews' chambers, she showed him the morning papers. His story was everywhere. Justice system on trial. Teen's case exposes bias. Judge orders sweeping changes after wrongful prosecution. A stand for truth. How one student fought the system and won. You've started something, she said. People are listening, talking, questioning their assumptions. Will it make a difference? Change happens one mind at a time, one case at a time. She smiled. Speaking of which, the State Bar Association called. They want you to share your story at their annual conference. Marcus thought about it. A month ago, he'd been a scared kid in handcuffs. Now he had a chance to help change the system that had wronged him. When do they need an answer? Take your time. But Marcus. She touched the photo of his grandfather. William always said the best way to fight injustice is to shine a light on it. You've lit quite a flame. Outside, the spring sun felt warmer somehow. Marcus walked with his mother to the bus stop, past the courthouse steps where reporters still gathered. You okay, baby? She asked. He touched his grandfather's watch. The inscription caught the light. Keep your integrity, no matter the cost. Yeah, he said. I think I am. Because sometimes justice comes not in grand gestures but in small victories. In changed minds and opened eyes. In one person standing up and saying, enough. Marcus Johnson had walked through the smoke. Now he could help others find their way to clearer air. 6 months had passed since Judge Rodriguez's ruling. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Central High School as Marcus adjusted his graduation cap. The auditorium buzzed with excitement. Hundreds of seniors preparing for their moment. You ready? James asked, appearing beside him. Their friendship had slowly rebuilt over the past months, stronger now for having been tested. Almost. Marcus touched his grandfather's watch. He'd added a new inscription beside the old one. Truth finds its way. Principal Warner approached, looking uncomfortable. He'd been especially courteous since the forced suspension had been exposed during the investigation. Marcus, the press is asking if you'll give a statement after the ceremony. As valedictorian, you already cleared it with Mr. Chen, Marcus said. His lawyer had become a trusted advisor, helping him navigate his new public role. The principal nodded and hurried away. Marcus watched him go, remembering the day he'd returned to school after his exoneration. The whispers had followed him then too, but different ones. Did you see the news? They tried to frame him. Can't believe we doubted him. Mrs. Rodriguez had hugged him in calculus class. I knew you'd be back, she'd said. Never doubted it. Now, standing in his graduation robes, Marcus felt the weight of the past 6 months. The ACLU lawsuit was proceeding. The Department of Justice had opened a civil rights investigation. 3 prosecutors had lost their law licenses. But more importantly, things were changing in smaller ways. His mother had started her own cleaning business, hiring other housekeepers who'd faced discrimination. The Petersons had tried to apologize, offering to be references. She'd declined politely. I'm done cleaning other people's houses, she'd said. Time to build something of my own. The oak tree outside the library had a new plaque now, dedicated to truth and justice. Students still studied there, from all neighborhoods. No one called the police on them. Places, everyone. The graduation coordinator clapped her hands. 5 minutes. Marcus took his position at the front of the line. As valedictorian, he'd speak first. His speech notes felt heavy in his pocket. The ceremony began. Parents filled the auditorium. Marcus spotted his mother in the front row, sitting between Mr. Chen and Judge Matthews. Other familiar faces dotted the crowd. Mrs. Rodriguez, James's family, even some former witnesses from his trial who'd reached out to make amends. Principal Warner gave a generic speech about futures and dreams then. And now, our valedictorian, Marcus Johnson. The applause was genuine, enthusiastic. Marcus approached the podium, adjusted the microphone. A year ago, I stood in a courtroom fighting for my freedom. Today, I stand here talking about the future. That's not just my story. It's a story about truth, justice, and the power of standing firm when the whole world doubts you. The audience grew quiet. My grandfather used to say that character isn't built by easy choices. It's built by hard ones. By choosing truth when lies would be easier. By maintaining dignity when others try to strip it away. By walking through smoke to reach justice. He saw his mother wipe away tears. Some of you know my story. How studying for college turned into a nightmare of false accusations and prejudice. How the system meant to protect justice almost destroyed it. But that's not the whole story. Marcus gripped the podium edges. The whole story includes a public defender who believed in truth more than victory. A judge who faced her own biases and chose integrity. Teachers who stood by me. Friends who found the courage to speak up. And most importantly, a grandfather who taught me that integrity matters more than convenience. He touched his watch. We're graduating into a world that still struggles with prejudice, with assumptions, with the easy comfort of believing what we expect to see rather than what's true. But we have the power to change that world. Not through grand gestures, but through daily choices. Through small acts of courage. Through standing up when it would be easier to stay silent. The sunlight through the windows seemed brighter. Next fall, I'm starting at State University's pre-law program. Not Princeton, where I once dreamed of going. But dreams change. Sometimes they have to break before they can rebuild into something stronger. He saw Judge Matthews nodding. I've learned that justice isn't just a concept in law books. It's alive in every choice we make. Every assumption we challenge. Every time we choose to see people as they are, not as we fear they might be. The auditorium was absolutely silent now. So as we leave high school behind, I challenge you, choose truth, even when lies are easier. Choose integrity, even when convenience tempts you. Choose to see people as they are, not as your fears paint them. Because in the end, we're all walking through smoke, trying to find our way to clearer air. He paused, letting the words sink in. My grandfather's watch bears 2 inscriptions now. The old one says, keep your integrity, no matter the cost. The new one says truth finds its way. Both are right. Both are needed. Because sometimes the cost of integrity is high. But truth always finds its way through the smoke. After the ceremony, reporters clustered around him. Any comment on the DOJ investigation? Will you continue your advocacy work in college? What message do you have for other young men facing similar situations? Marcus answered carefully, as Mr. Chen had taught him. But his real message had already been delivered, not to the cameras, but to the graduates and families who'd listened to his speech. Later, at home, his mother hung his diploma beside his grandfather's old photo. He's watching, she said softly. He knows. Marcus touched the watch. Think he'd be proud? Baby, he was always proud. But now, she hugged him. Now he's got company. The whole world seeing what he always saw in you. That evening, Marcus walked to his grandfather's grave. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and purple. Hey, Pop, he said quietly. I graduated today. Gave a speech about truth and smoke and finding your way through. Wish you could have been there. But then again, maybe you were. He placed his graduation tassel on the headstone. I'm not going to Princeton, but I think I'm going somewhere better. Somewhere I can help change things. Help other kids find their way through the smoke. A warm breeze rustled the grass. You always said integrity costs something. You were right, but you never said what we gain from paying that cost. Never told me that standing for truth makes you stronger. That walking through smoke teaches you how to help others find their way. Marcus stood, brushing grass from his knees. I get it now, Pop Pop. Why you ran into that fire to save Judge Matthews. Why you fought that old theft accusation instead of taking the easy way out. Why you taught me that character matters more than comfort. He touched the watch one last time. Truth found its way, just like you always said it would, and I'm going to help it find its way for others too. Walking home in the gathering dusk, Marcus felt at peace. The past year had changed him, broken him down, and rebuilt him stronger. Princeton dreams had become justice dreams, fear had become purpose. His phone buzzed, Judge Matthews confirming his summer internship at the courthouse. Another buzz, Mr. Chen with details about the next ACLU meeting. A third, his mother sending a photo of his diploma. Marcus Johnson wasn't just the kid who'd beaten false charges anymore. He was something more, a voice for truth, a light in the smoke, a reminder that justice prevails when people stand firm. His grandfather had taught him how to walk through smoke. Now he would teach others, because sometimes the hardest paths lead to the clearest air. Sometimes the heaviest costs yield the richest rewards. Sometimes truth finds its way through the darkest smoke, carried by those brave enough to keep walking, strong enough to keep believing, determined enough to light the way for others. Marcus smiled in the gathering dark. It was time for new beginnings. Time to help others find their way through the smoke to clearer air beyond.